So we are concerned about what a future Trump administration may do with family separation. But I want to be clear that the family separation that occurred under the first term is still not over for a few reasons. One is, as you point out, there are still families that are separated. We believe that approximately 1,000 families may still be separated. The reason we don't know for sure is because we are still looking for many families 6 years later, and because the Trump administration did not keep proper records. So that means there were kids who were 2 and 3 years old when they were separated from their parents, who've basically grown up without their parents. So we are still searching for these families and still hope to get them reunited.
Welcome to another episode of Just the Facts with the Watergate Girl, me, Jill Wine-Banks. And today we have a fantastic guest on a really hot current issue, immigration. Lee Gelernt has been a frequent guest on iGen Politics, one of the few who made multiple appearances. And so thank you for being back with us today, Lee. I know that our audience probably knows you, but just to briefly state, you are, of course, an ACLU immigration superstar and have taken cases all the way to the Supreme Court. You have protected numerous people. You are featured in a movie called, I'm just forgetting the name, called, what's the name of the movie? Oh, Fight, which is, if please, all of you viewers, go on Google and look up Fight. You can watch it online. If you don't cry, I will be surprised, because I certainly did. I thought there were some of the issues that the ACLU is protecting democracy with are really emotional, including the one that you did, Lee. So thank you for that, and welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. When you were on iGen, we talked about child separation, family separation, the total ban on all Muslims coming to this country, which Donald Trump tried to impose in his first term. We talked about him using Title 42 to keep out immigrants, Title 42 being a health-related section. And the Biden administration tried to reverse that. I think we also may have talked about Texas's inhumane use of barbed wire and buoys to keep immigrants out of crossing the river into Texas. Of course, Trump's wall that Mexico was going to pay for, that never happened. That was Trump 45, and that was pretty scary. Now we are about to face Trump 47. And so I want to talk about what you see coming and whether it's worse than what we dealt with and that you had to go to court to fight when it was 45.
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, it's going to be worse. I think that they have been preparing for the past 4 years to do this. They feel like they have a mandate on immigration. I am less sure that they have the kind of mandate they think they have, and I want to talk about that. But I think overall it's going to be much worse, both because they're prepared, both because they believe they have the mandate, and because there are people who just want to take as draconian steps as possible. So I think we are looking at, obviously, mass deportation, and that could take a variety of forms. One thing they're threatening is to use the military, which is very, very scary, to be using the military for something like immigration.
It's not just scary, Lee. I worked in the Pentagon as General Counsel of the Army.
Right.
It's illegal. There's no question that the use of our military forces in this domestic situation, where we are not at war, where there is no invasion, is obscene and ridiculous.
Well, that's certainly our view, that the Alien Enemies Act, which he's threatening to use, does not permit him to be used for immigration purposes. As you said, it requires either a declared war with a foreign government or an invasion by a foreign government or threatened invasion. That's not what's happening here. I mean, migration numbers are high. Everyone knows that. But to call that an invasion by a foreign government is an absolute stretch. And we and others are prepared to go to court on that. And I think that's just one of the scary things he's talking about. He's also talking about reversing trying to reverse what's in the 14th Amendment and say if you're born on U.S. soil but your parents are undocumented, you no longer have citizenship. they're going to ask the Supreme Court, I gather, to overturn long-standing precedent on that, which interprets clear text from the 14th Amendment. I think we are going to see not only shutting down the border to genuine asylum seekers, but going after people in the interior, trying to sweep up people, not just sweep them up, but have summary deportations, which means no due process whatsoever. I think we're going to see enormous mistakes with that. We're going to see people pulled out of the streets in the interior. I think children are going to be separated. I think there's just a whole host of things that are going to happen. And I think we're going to talk about what the steps are to combat that, but I do think that we are looking at something worse than the first
Let's
time.
take each of those things separately, because each one of them is horrible. Of course, combined, it may be worse. This may not be a case where the individual components are worse than the combined. I think the combined is 10 times worse than the individuals, but each individual is terrible. So you started by mentioning mass deportation, which is something that Donald Trump has said he wants to do on day one of his presidency.
Right.
And let's not ignore the fact that he has said he is going to nominate Homan as his secretary to do this. And that Homan on 60 Minutes said, well, we don't have to separate families. We can just deport them all together, even if they're American citizens, even if they have papers to be here. So that's even worse than family separation in some ways. It's like throwing out Americans, especially if you combine it with the other thing you mentioned, which is birthright citizenship. So let me start with the birthright citizenship and then move to deportation question. My understanding is that the 14th Amendment is crystal clear that if you are born on American soil, you are an American citizen. There's no question about that. Tell me why you think the Supreme Court may deviate. They say that they are textualists, that they believe the words are the words, and that the intent is the intent. Well, it seems to me the intent was, and the words say, that if you're born here, you are a citizen. And it doesn't matter if you're born from a mother who is not a citizen, who is not documented, you're still a citizen. So
Right.
tell me about that. And tell me, I have a friend who has raised this issue, and she's afraid, or she says that a friend of hers is afraid, that because her grandparents were not citizens, that she, who is now a two-generation citizen by birthright, could be deported. First of all, is that at all possible? And second of all, go ahead with all the other legal arguments.
Right. So we don't know actually what the Trump administration is intending to do. So we are preparing for everything. The scenario you raised of your friend of a friend would be retroactively applying this rule to say, well, even if you got citizenship previously, we're going to try and take it away. We have not heard the Trump administration talk about that. I think that would be an enormous additional step for them to take.
Yeah.
So we'll be prepared for that. But I think what we're most prepared for is going forward. Are they not going to give people citizenship papers who are applying for them now or born after the administration takes place? But I'm not going to rule out anything. In terms of the legal issues,
Well, that's a good, you're saying it's not going to be retroactive. It's only
well, no,
if,
I can't predict what's going to happen.
No.
Right now, we're assuming it's going to be prospective, but truthfully, given the kinds of statements that the transition team's been making and during the campaign, I'm not going to rule out anything. So I don't want to suggest that I'm predicting definitely, but I think the first step may be prospectively. And I'm not disagreeing with anything you're saying about the legality. I think the 14th Amendment is clear, and more importantly, the Supreme Court has already interpreted it. So I think what the Trump administration would be saying to the Supreme Court is reverse this long-standing precedent and change the way America has always operated. I am not one of those people that's giving up on the courts, the Supreme Court or the lower courts. And I think that if the Trump administration really oversteps the line, they'll say so. The Supreme Court will say so. You know, obviously everyone is worried about where the courts are going to go. I am hopeful that the Supreme Court says we're not going to reverse all this precedent. The 14th Amendment is clear, and this would be just a radical change to the basic fabric of America. So, look, am I going to sit here and say there's no chance that we lose this case? No, I would never say that. But I do think, as you said, the arguments are really strong in our favor, and the precedent is there, long-standing precedent. Whether the Trump administration says we want the Supreme Court now to reverse everything, we'll see.
You also mentioned about family separation, and there were a lot of families separated who, to my understanding, still have not been reunited. Do you
Yeah,
have any numbers on that?
yeah, I'm glad you raised that. So we are concerned about what a future Trump administration may do with family separation, but I want to be clear that the family separation that occurred under the first term is still not over for a few reasons. One is, as you point out, there are still families that are separated. We believe that approximately 1,000 families may still be separated. The reason we don't know for sure is because we are still looking for many families 6 years later, and because the Trump administration did not keep proper records. So that means there were kids who were 2 and 3 years old when they were separated from their parents, who've basically grown up without their parents. So we are still searching for these families and still hope to get them reunited. But this is a devastating situation where
What is the
children.
custody of those children? Are they with family in
So
America
the
or are
children
they in
are
foster homes?
their children are both with relatives, maybe relatives they never knew, probably didn't know, and with foster families, some combination of both. And so we're still searching for the parents or trying to find the children and reunite them. The other part of it is, as you and I have talked about in the past, is even for children who have been reunited, the trauma is so devastating. We're working with children, little children, 3 and 4 years old, who stand by the window in their house now looking to see if men are going to come and take them away again. 4 year old who's asking his mother, is it all right if I go to sleep now? Are men going to come and take me out of my bed again and take me away? And it's the parents also who are absolutely devastated because their children were too young to understand what was going on. So often the first words from the children when they're reunited with their parent is, Mommy, Daddy, didn't you love me enough to keep me? Why didn't you fight for me? Why didn't you care? And so the parents are living with that unbelievable guilt. So there's all that going on. And then we now have a Trump administration coming in who hopefully will honor the settlement agreement we have with the Biden administration. If they don't, we'll be right back in court. But that settlement agreement does some very important things. One is it requires reunification. It also gives them a streamlined special asylum process so they can remain in the country, parole so they can't be removed, and certain medical and housing benefits. But, we're going to have to monitor very closely whether the Trump administration tries to undermine those benefits and also whether they try, notwithstanding the settlement provision saying no more family separation for 8 years, whether the Trump administration tries to undermine that settlement. So we're very concerned about separations. The other point you mentioned is what Tom Homan said about now going after families. And so I think what we're going to see are separations, sort of forced, coercive separations, not the same as in the first term where they were being pulled away from their parents, literally ripped away. But if they're going to start going after families, parents, grandparents who have committed no crimes just so they can say they've deported as many people as possible, those families are going to be facing an excruciating decision. Do they take their U.S. citizen child with them to a country that the child has never stepped foot in, or do they leave their child behind and remain separated from their child? I do not think that Homan was actually saying they could deport U.S. citizen children. I think he was saying we're going to make it so bad for the parents that they're going to have to take their children with them. But either way, we're talking about mass separations or U.S. citizen children having to now go live in a country they've never stepped foot in. And
That sounds so
yeah,
tragic and sad, and it must make your job so emotionally draining. I can only imagine how you feel. You did mention many things in that I think are worth following up on, because Donald Trump has Project 2025 and has had 4 years to think about what he didn't accomplish that he wanted to, excuse me, in his first term. Um, what things are you expecting to be the big issues in terms of immigration starting on day one? And if you could include in that answer, or separately, about the bipartisan bill that Donald Trump killed.
right.
Talk about whether that was a good starting point, at least a starting point, maybe even was good enough to be the answer, or what you would have added to that as well.
Yeah, well, let me start with the bill because that got a lot of attention during the
Yeah.
campaign. And President Biden and Vice President Harris pushed for that bill, and a lot of Democrats joined. And as you know, President Trump killed it because he wanted to run on the issue. The ACLU opposed that bill, and the reason we opposed it, I mean, there were a lot of good things in it. The reason we opposed it is we felt like it wasn't a balanced approach. We are all for reform at the border, but there needs to be some safety valve for people fleeing danger who are genuinely going to be persecuted or tortured. This bill would virtually have shut down the border. And I think when people look at it as just as an abstraction, they say, oh, sure, close the border completely. But then if you show them individual cases, someone fleeing because they're Christian and they're being persecuted because of that, or a family who's going to be tortured because of their political views or religion, you say, well, wait, oh no, those need to be, asylum needs to be available for those people. And so I don't think people recognize how bad the bill was in that sense. But I think what we're in danger of now is that just being a floor. I'd be surprised if the Trump administration, the Republicans, stop with that. I think we're going to see something that completely shuts off the border. And that's really tragic and a sea change in America. After World War II, we said we would never send people back to danger without at least screening them. We need to have at least a screening process. Does everyone entitled to asylum? No, of course not. But you have to make sure there's at least a screening process. Can we make that screening process more efficient? Of course, and let's do that, but let's not completely shut down the border.
So, Lee, can I ask you a question? Because
Yeah.
I want to make sure I understand. I thought part of the bill was to create more immigration judges, hearing officers who could quickly deal with the applications to allow those with credible claims of a need for fleeing their country for legitimate reasons, that they would be able to not be turned away at the border, that there would be hearings.
So
And
you're
is
right.
that correct?
So we were in favor of more immigration judges and
Yeah.
more asylum officers to do the screenings. But the problem is that what didn't leak out as much is that the number of people who would get screened, it was such a narrow window that it was so few people who would actually be entitled to a screening. There would be virtually no asylum, and you could only apply for forms of relief that required a greater showing, a heightened showing at the border, which people can't make by themselves without a lawyer. And they would also have to have known to ask for those screenings. People don't know to ask for those screenings. They're too scared to speak up. And so while we were in favor of more immigration judges and asylum officers to do the screenings, we felt like it cut down the number of people who would actually get those screenings to such a small number that it made the increase in judges and asylum officers meaningless. So we wanted to see more of a balanced approach. In terms of what we're going to see day one, I think we're going to see deportation efforts right from the beginning. I think we're going to see ICE officers in the interior. I think we're going to see deputization of local police, especially in places like Texas, where they now bring on local police to round up immigrants. I think we may see an attempt to eliminate birthright citizenship on day one. We may see him attempt to invoke the Alien Enemies Act we were discussing before to try and use the military. I think we may see an enormous amount on day one because, as you said, they've been preparing with the 2025 project for this for 4 years. I think in the first time around, they weren't really prepared. They threw out a lot of stuff. But this time, they've been working for 4 years. The one thing I would say about where the politics are and whether they really have a mandate is I think there's a mandate in the abstract to have immigration reform, and we want immigration reform as well. But I think once the American public sees what it looks like in practice, I'm hopeful there will be pushback. The first term, we thought, well, I've dehumanized immigrants to such an extent I can do whatever I want. The public's sort of gone to sleep. Then he did family separation, and both progressives and conservatives, Republicans and Democrats, and in worldwide attention, actually said we're repulsed by you taking away little babies from their parents. Even the Pope spoke out about it, Laura Bush. And so the public did say, wait, we want immigration reform, but there's a line over which we don't want you to cross. I think if people see immigration officers, maybe even the military, walking down the streets looking for immigrants, going after families who have lived here for a long time, have been paying their taxes, working, have U.S. citizen children, no criminal record, and all of a sudden we see little children being left behind. I'm hopeful that the public will speak out and say, that's not what we meant by immigration reform. I'm not giving hope on that.
I think there was a huge misunderstanding among many voters who voted for Trump, thinking, well, he doesn't mean me, he doesn't mean my family.
Exactly.
And there was a word used that I think helped to create that misinformation, which was, we're going to go after criminals
Right.
who are here. But I think, my opinion, that when he said criminals, he meant you're criminal because you're here without documentation. You
Right.
violated our law by being here. Not that you have then committed a crime in America. He wasn't going to just go after the people who commit crimes in America,
Right.
burglary, murder. That wasn't what he meant. He meant you are a criminal, so I'm going to deport all. Do you
I think
think that I'm wrong, or?
I think you're right to point that out because we're talking about deporting millions and millions of people. That means going well beyond people
Yeah.
with serious criminal convictions. I think you're right. They're saying anybody who's here illegally. I think it's going to have a devastating effect on the economy. We're going to see little children left behind ending up in foster care. And so the point you made is critical that people say, well, wait, that's not who I thought he was going to go after, or not my family, or not. I can't tell you how many calls I got during the first term where someone would call up and say, wait, Lee, they're deporting the custodian in my son's school. He's the nicest man. I didn't know they were going to go after people like that. That's why I think it's going to be critical for advocates, the American public generally, religious organizations, and the media to document the effects of what mass immigration, mass deportation would actually look like.
I think you're going to also see businesses, corporations going, whoa, our economy is going to collapse if you do this. Our economy, for example, migrant workers in the fields are responsible for our having food on our table, for having fruits and vegetables. And if we don't have them, if they are all deported, there are not enough workers left in America. Our unemployment rate is unbelievably low. And so that worries me. And I think people aren't as concerned about that as they should be, in the same way that they weren't concerned. Oh, it doesn't mean me. He means someone else. He did mean you. He does. And
Yeah.
it's so awful.
I mean, I'm
Would you?
hopeful that businesses will speak out and say, look, we can't do this without migrant workers. It doesn't mean we don't want higher wages for everyone, but we can't do it. We can't deport 10 million people and expect our economy just to move on. So I think that is critical. I think religious organizations need to speak out.
Yeah.
But businesses, absolutely, they're a critical part of this. That's where people all of a sudden say, well, wait, okay, maybe I don't know anybody who's being deported, but all of a sudden my prices are higher. The supply chain is screwed up. And then they say, oh, okay, maybe it was a nice soundbite to say we're going to deport 10 million people, but it actually is not the right thing to do. I mean, both morally, ethically, but also from an economic standpoint.
Are there any legal impediments to this mass deportation? And what steps are you and any organizations that you and the ACLU work with, what are you planning when this inevitably happens?
Right. So the first time around, we were caught off guard, I think, like a lot of people.
Yeah.
We had thought there would be a Clinton administration and things would be different. So we had to scramble. This time around, we obviously knew there was a real chance he'd be elected. And so we've been preparing since the winter for a variety of things. Unfortunately, we still don't know exactly what he's going to do, so we're preparing for everything. In terms of mass deportation, I think two things are important. One is how he goes about it. So if he tries to use the military or do other things like that, we would prepare or eliminate all hearings in any due process. We're prepared to go to court on that. But the second point is there are really harsh measures they can take that are not illegal, right? I mean, deportations are lawful, and the only reason, and the immigration laws give the president an enormous amount of discretion, the only reason it hasn't become comparatively more inhumane over the years is both Democratic and Republican presidents have exercised some discretion. We're not going to go after families who don't have criminal records and separate the families. And so he can do that if he wants, and it wouldn't be per se illegal. We'll be looking to see if there's profiling, if there's Fourth Amendment violations. But I think the real pushback may have to come from the public and the media documenting what it looks like to start deporting a family with U.S. citizen children, and forcing that separation, and to have the American public say, wait, that's not what we want. Let's rein it in and go after hardened criminals or national security threats. But if we can't document it, if we can't humanize it, if we can't show real life stories, I think it's going to be very hard. I very much worry about abstract policy arguments and aggregate statistics blurring the human dimension of this. So I think it's going to be on all of us to really document it and then push back, because there are going to be certain things we can't stop in court. And I think, as you know, any civil rights lawyer will tell you there's a limit to what you can accomplish in court, and you need that sort of public reaction. And that's what happened with family separation. It was both an in-court strategy and the public worldwide pushback.
So one of the reasons that I mentioned Fight, the documentary in which you are one of the featured ACLU lawyers, is because it does humanize. It shows a particular case,
Right.
a particular person with whom you cannot help but be sympathetic.
Yeah.
And so I think you're right that humanization of the issue, it's one thing to sort of say, well, yeah, I think we have a problem at the border, but not my neighbor. I don't want you deporting my neighbor. He's a nice person. She's a wonderful cook. Our children played. I mean, those are the kind of things that I think you may be right. But the other thing is, I worry about this court. I mean, ultimately, this court has done everything that Donald Trump wanted. He got rid of Roe versus Wade. They gave him total immunity, basically, and we've seen the result today. No justice, no accountability, which also means he is going to be free in his mind to do anything he wants because he knows there will be no accountability, that he gets out of office and he's home free because the Supreme Court said so. So it could get a lot worse. Are you as worried about the court deviating from precedent as I am?
Well, look, I need to be clear-eyed about it, and I'm not going to be Pollyannish about it. The court has shown a willingness to get rid of certain precedent. Obviously, you mentioned some of it. So, I guess what I would say is, as a civil rights lawyer, I can never give up on the courts. I always have to have the belief the courts will do the right thing, and I'm hoping the Supreme Court, where the law is on our side, will do the right thing, and so we will keep fighting in court. But the court has shifted to some extent, and so it is what it is. You've laid it out there, but I do think both because you can never rely on the courts completely, because winning cases in court is hard, but also because certain things they can do are legal. They're just harsh and inhumane, but legal. It's going to take that pushback. I think we're going to be clear-eyed that we're not going to stop everything in court, and we really need the public to monitor closely what he's doing and say, wait, enough's enough, just like they did with family separation. But
I seriously worry about that, because I think that in some ways Trump has been very effective in desensitizing America,
right,
and making things seem normal that are completely inhumane and abnormal. When you said the public reaction could make a difference, it did in Watergate. In Watergate, the public reaction to the Saturday Night Massacre was, you can't get away with this, Mr. Nixon. And 3 days after he fired Archie Cox, he said, okay, I'll give you the subpoenaed tapes and I will hire a new special prosecutor. He was inundated with public reaction, which came in those days not by email, but by actual snail mail. I mean, huge canvas sacks of mail were delivered to the White House and to our offices in support of us and against the White House. But that's not happening now. So I wonder, and of course I'm sure you follow on social media that people are really, I'm giving up. I am not marching. I am not fighting. I'm done. It's hopeless. And we need to give them some hope that they can have effect. Do you think they can? Tell me what we can say to our viewers.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right to bring up all those points. Right now, I think there's a feeling of dread and a feeling like we can't accomplish anything. And so I would say a few things. One is I think the struggle, the fight is worth having regardless of what you accomplish. But I do think we can accomplish something. It always is going to seem like you can't. But I do think, just like with family separation and other things, we will be able to push back if people get energized again. Right now, I think people are still sort of feeling the PTSD from the first time around,
Yeah.
and it's helpless. I do think that we'll be able to accomplish that, but a couple of things on that. One is I don't think you can judge it by can we stop everything, and if we can't, then let's not try at all. I mean, every family you help is doing something, right? And so that, especially for young people out there, don't feel like, well, because the problem is so big, I can't stop it, therefore I'm not going to do anything. Help one family, volunteer to do one case if you're a lawyer, even if you're not a lawyer, if you're a translator, or tutor one kid. Do anything. Every little thing you do helps a desperate family, and it will have, I think, a collective effect, but we just need to start, and the momentum will build on each other. I don't think we can give up. And what keeps me going is every time I feel like this is helpless, I'm too tired, I go then meet with clients, and you see them persevering. They are struggling for their lives. And it's really hard to then come back to my office and say, well, I'm too tired. This seems too hard, when they are fighting for their lives. And so the more I think we get these stories out, the more I'm hopeful that people will just get involved and don't feel like because you can't do everything, you shouldn't do any little thing. I think that's the critical thing. Law students out there, college students, anybody, volunteer to do any little thing. It
Yeah.
all helps. The more you meet people who are fighting for their lives, the more you will become invested in it.
That is so absolutely true, correct, and motivating. I hope everyone listening will follow that advice. Do not give up because the problem is so big. It's sort of like when you feel an elephant, you only feel one little thing, but that can make a difference. So
Right.
do the one thing that is within your power. That's what all of you can do, is to keep up the fight and do one thing to make a difference, and then join the ACLU and help Lee to fight the bigger picture, because he is doing a fantastic job. Watch the film Fight on Google. Just find it on, it's on many platforms for you to see. And thank you, Lee, for joining us today. And thank you more for all the work you do.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate you shining a light, as you have been for so many years, shining a light on these issues. I really appreciate you having me.
Remember, all of these people could be your neighbor, and each one has a great story to tell.